Hello, beautiful community. We're going to talk about what kind of political world Zelensky sent his statement that he made in the Baltics recently, that the war must not be frozen. What kind of world did he send that statement into? And we'll say a few gentle things, we'll say a few stark things, and we'll try to be gentle about doing that. And we'll apply, I think, one interesting piece of political wisdom that has nothing to do with any particular conflict. So let's do it. Zelensky just said, let's not freeze the war. To endure this year, he said, is not to surrender some of our territories, not to let anyone freeze the conflict. To prevent Russia from preparing for a powerful counteroffensive in a year or 2 or 3 or 5. To prevent them from doing so, to end the war before that. Not to allow them to increase production, freeze the conflict this year so they can take time and make preparations for, a future war. Before we talk about how to think about what world this is set into, let's just make a couple of simple remarks. First of all, is Zelensky aware, are people in his administration aware that Putin won't stop unless he is stopped? And the answer to that is clearly yes. Now, Zelensky doesn't like to think deeply about these things, so he'll say, well, that and this is obviously true about Putin, and then this other stuff, well, I don't get to think about it because I get the basic picture. Let's just do what needs to be done. If only it were clear what needs to be done. But without thinking about it deeply, without having a theory about exactly why Putin invaded, without even being interested in one, Zelensky does get that Putin won't stop unless he is stopped, and basically people in positions of power in Ukraine get that. And that can't be said for everybody in Western centers of power. Second observation about Zelensky. What's hard for his administration is not just that the Western help is limited and becoming more limited, it's that it's uncertain and the West's position is uncertain. So forget about Trump. Zelensky doesn't even know what the Biden administration will do or say a few months from now. So that's especially difficult, not knowing where one stands. So let's jump into this. What's the trend? The trend is that the West wants to freeze the war. The West is very heavily leaning into freezing the war. But it can't. It doesn't know how to. It doesn't see a way to do that, but it really wants to find one. And so it wants to explore ways of freezing the war that make sense. And I won't recite my own account of why the war can't be frozen sustainably. But the West is looking for this elusive possibility, and there's a lot of pressure on people making decisions in important centers of power in the West to lean into that possibility, even if it can't yield anything. But that's where we're going. So the positions that we're seeing is that the West wants to freeze the war but doesn't know how to. And it's fine to generalize here, right? Because we can, of course, say quite different things about different countries, but we'd better be able to generalize. It's no help to Ukraine when it doesn't have enough of this and doesn't have enough of that to point out that some countries would be in favor of it getting these things if it doesn't actually end up getting these things. Now, the West wants to freeze the war but doesn't know how to. Putin wants no talks, or talks as a means of gaining an advantage in a longer-term war. And Ukraine is in this difficult position of not knowing where its backers stand. But it's also in this extraordinarily difficult position of feeling that Plan A isn't working to regain all its territories in a short to medium term. And it hasn't yet had, I would say it hasn't even begun, a civic conversation properly about what other options there are out there. So that's Ukrainian citizens asking themselves, what do we want to hear from our government about our future that is hopeful and reassuring, if we're not going to get our territories back in 2024. So this is not something that is a forte of Zelensky's, actually, this type of leadership, but it's very important that we're going to see either that or an absence of that as a dominant factor in Ukrainian politics in 2024. People are going to ask the government for a picture, an alternative picture of the future, or several alternative pictures of the future that acknowledge that the territories might not be got back in the near term at the very least, but still nevertheless paint a picture, and that's an enormously difficult task, of how Ukraine's security, Ukraine's independence, and Ukraine's development to some extent is reconcilable with this situation. What other ways of positively and constructively thinking about our future are there if Plan A is not about to work? Just make a quick community remark here. I remember really from the beginning of the war, when I began talking about how the West is committed to what I called independence plus. That's to say, I said that the West wasn't committed to Ukrainian victory, which wasn't incompatible with the Ukrainian victory, but that just was always going to depend on other contingencies. But the West never made a political commitment to Ukraine regaining its territories. Now, at that time, I actually think most of you watching this now got this. You sensed that was where the West was at cumulatively. But a small minority of you was enormously frustrated with me saying that, because that minority of the community who stayed in the community felt, well, what is he talking about? Of course the West is committed to Ukrainian victory. And likewise, you might be tempted now to say, well, no, the West is not trying to explore how to freeze the war. What's your evidence for this? And I think there are two patterns here that are very important. One is depoliticization, and the other is what I call a crisis of interpretation that we're all living through. The depoliticization is that it's tempting for all of us to give up on engaging in conflict effectively if we have found ways of belonging to our group effectively. Right, it's one of the dangers of NAFO. So you might feel you have effectively integrated yourself into a group, but obviously, right, if you set yourself some kind of a normative goal like helping Ukraine or defeating Putin, it's not going to help to misinterpret the cumulative intent of a central agent, the West. You want to get what the West is vaguely trying to do right. You don't want to be wrong about that, because then anything you do, think, or say as a conscious, civically conscious, responsible citizen is not going to be as helpful. And that's depoliticization, I'm afraid. There's a global crisis of depoliticization. The second thing is that we have a crisis of interpretation. And you might say, well, what are you talking about? We're bad at just facts themselves. We can't even agree on a shared fact world. That's true, but the crisis of interpretation involves most people, whereas the crisis of facts still involves large minorities of people. And what happened was that folks were very outraged, that small minority of folks were very outraged that I was saying that Ukraine had Western support up to independence plus, and anything else was going to be a bonus. And a question that recurred in these messages that I got was, what's your evidence for this? Can you give a statement by Western leaders where they say, we're not committed to Ukrainian victory, we're just committed to independence plus, or something that was a substitute for that terminology? And so what was being sought there was a fact, as opposed to an interpretation, when of course what was being offered is an interpretation. And our crisis of interpretation is actually that we are so-so, but okay, at doing facts. In the scheme of where we were in the 1990s, in the early noughties, we're terrible at doing facts. But in the scheme of, the last couple of centuries of European history, we're so-so at doing facts. And we are not too bad at doing normative stuff. So saying what our shoulds and oughts and would likes are. But we do often struggle with interpretation, right? That's to say, when there is something about the world to get right, but it isn't just a matter of fact. Now you might say all facts are up to a point a matter of interpretation because they involve various kinds of presuppositions. You'd be right, but the distinction between facts and interpretation would then not be a pure one, but it'd be a distinction of extent of such presuppositions or suppositions or assumptions. So if I said that there's a conflict in Eastern Europe and two armies are fighting each other, everyone would agree. If I said the Putin regime invaded Ukraine, Russia invaded Ukraine, all of us here would agree, and I would consider that a fact, but some people would dispute it, right? Because folks in the Kremlin might think that Ukrainians aren't real, and therefore how can you invade them, and so on and so forth. And so even that fact might get disputed because it requires various presuppositions. But you know the difference. You know the difference, right? Between a matter of fact and something that requires insight, that's something that can't be demonstrated, can't be proven. It's a matter of evaluation and interpretation. And we're having a crisis of that. We tend to be very bad about that. In other words, if I'm committed to a certain way of looking at the world, and somebody comes along and says, boom, 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 you're wrong, I will consider their point if they give me a fact. But if they give me an interpretation, I'm just going to bat it away. I'm not going to engage with that evaluatively and see if I should question myself. So I think that's very fascinating. So we can always learn from each other's mistakes. If somebody is being deeply offensive, dismiss them. But if somebody is struggling in a certain sense, there's always the possibility, epistemically in a certain sense, there's always the possibility for us to learn from that, because what these people who wrote to me saying, Vlad, you're completely delusional that the West isn't committed to Ukrainian victory, what they did is give us in an intensified form a problem that we all together as a culture have and need to reflect on, and we should be grateful for that. Now, I think we've said enough about the West tendentiously. I wanna freeze the war, but I don't see a way to do this. That's the position. How's Ukraine going to react to this? And I think Ukraine's going to react to this in two stages. One is the sort of thing Zelensky just did. That's to say, push against it, argue against it, explain why it's not going to work, and do everything, not everything in their power, because Ukraine could do a lot more actually than it's doing, and at the level of engaging with Western political elites, but they're going to try in their own way to slow that process of the West leaning more and more and more into exploring the possibility of freezing the war. It's the first thing Ukraine will do. The second thing Ukraine will do, especially if the West is getting very, very close to a kind of orbit that's about the United States and Russia getting together with Ukraine, no longer a primary player, and putting something together. Well, by that stage, Ukraine would be engaging in very active measures to disrupt and undermine that, and that would entail various measures of escalation. Ukraine would try to escalate the war, perhaps escalate it via various asymmetrical steps. So that will be the playbook. They're going to push and argue against it, but then they're also going to disrupt in any way they can this Western trend. The closer the West gets to this, what I actually think is an illusory destination of sustainably freezing the war, but the closer the West gets to something like that, the more measures Ukraine will take to disrupt it and sort of reactivate the war in various ways that will make that less appealing to the West. And I want to introduce a little principle here, and I've just tweeted it, and here is what it is. Some political progress is like canoeing on the river. You paddle along and see how far you can get. But some political progress is like swimming across the river. If you can't make it to the other side, you shouldn't cross the river at all. There is this tendency to think that, but why not try when it comes to any political goal? Because we have this terribly false analogy in our head that all progress in politics is sort of like a continuum where we are just paddling down the river or just walking toward a certain destination, and with each step the climbs get sunnier if we make steps forward, and if we don't, they don't. But that's true of a lot of political progress, but it's also false of a lot of political progress. And sometimes aiming for the undoable can be much more destructive than aiming for something else. That's an alternative that you pick because the thing you had hoped for is undoable. And I'll leave it to you how you might apply this idea to the situation we're talking about. But I'll just say one thing. If you are working for the West to get committed to a full Ukrainian victory, which I would suggest is nearly an impossible goal, unless certain remarkable contingencies occur, like Putin using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. But if you're working toward that goal, and you want to think of yourself as working toward that goal, do it in a way that would benefit Ukraine, even if that goal didn't materialize. Of course, there are ways of doing that. But that's the only thing I'm going to say about the application of this principle. But it's an important principle. And it came up in our recent conversation, too, about what I called the West's democratic incapacity, or the limitation on the West's democratic capacity. When a democracy is in crisis, there's a lot less you can do in terms of framing a strategy that covers Russia, Ukrainian war, the Middle East, China, Taiwan. And very naturally, of course, the response came back, but why not try? And there's a lot of good in that response, but it also runs the risk of making the kind of misunderstanding we outlined by distinguishing the scenario of paddling down the river from the scenario of trying to swim across it. Because, you know, if it's 200 yards and you're 110 yards along and you've exhausted yourself and you're stuck with the currents, that's not, oh, we've done a halfway decent job, we've got halfway to where we wanted. No, you're in a situation that's actually completely politically counterproductive. Analogously speaking, directly speaking, you might drown. And that takes us back to this business of constructive and effective engagement in politics. Lots of love. Talk very soon.